Good day from the International Space Station Flight Control Room here at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. With NASA's InSight spacecraft on its way to Mars for an arrival in November, you are now looking live at the SpaceX Dragon cargo craft that is in the grasp of the Canadian-built Canadarm2 robotic arm, but not for long. Its release is scheduled in the next 22 minutes or so at about 8:24 a.m. Central Time. The release window opens up at 8:22 a.m. Central Time. That will begin the Dragon's return path to Earth for a splashdown in the Pacific later this afternoon. We'll be talking more about the timeline of events for SpaceX Dragon in just a moment. Here in the flight control room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the Orbit 2 team is on console on this Saturday morning, led by Flight Director Rick Henfling. He is the lead NASA flight director for this SpaceX mission at the bottom of your screen, joined on console this morning by spacecraft communicator Leslie Ringo. Ringo will be talking to the station crew from time to time as we go through the critical phase of Dragon's release over the next few minutes and its departure from the International Space Station. 3,000 miles away to the west, in the SpaceX Flight Control Center called MCCX, or the Mission Control Center for SpaceX in Hawthorne, California. Their flight control team is on console. They, of course, are responsible for Dragon operations once it departs the vicinity of the International Space Station all the way through its splashdown in the Pacific later today. Their mission director is Brian Coffey for this 14th resupply mission to the International Space Station.
Third one, which will be the large one, that will be
Dragon is completing a 4-week stay at the International Space Station. Its journey to the International Space Station began on April 2nd with its launch from the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. The Falcon 9 rocket lifted off into a cloudless sky over the Florida coast and climbed majestically into that blue sky. About a 9.5-minute journey to deposit the Dragon spacecraft into its initial orbit, from which it deployed its solar arrays and began a 2-day journey to the International Outpost. Dragon finally arrived at the station on April 4th, where it was captured by the space station crew using the Canadarm2 robotic arm, capture occurring right on time 4 weeks ago. Within a couple of hours after Dragon was in the grasp of the Canadarm2 robotic arm, it then was maneuvered into position for its installation on the Earth-facing port of the Harmony module of the International Space Station, carrying several tons of critical supplies and scientific hardware for experiments on board the International Laboratory. Back now live with a view of Dragon as the International Space Station flies just to the south of the southern tip of South Africa, about to begin a swing across the Indian Ocean, moving from northwest to southeast at an altitude of 255 statute miles. Yesterday morning, Friday morning, the crew on board the station, the Expedition 55 crew, closed the hatch to Dragon after finally completing the stowage of critical science experiments and other hardware to be returned back to Earth, including spare parts that will be refurbished and reflown to the station at a later date. Late yesterday afternoon, the ground controllers here in Houston operated the common berthing mechanisms, unbolting Dragon from the nadir port of the Harmony module, and robotic ground controllers then maneuvered Dragon into an overnight park position and finally early this morning to its release position that the Dragon spacecraft is in at the moment. As we mentioned before, the release is scheduled about 19 minutes from now at 8:24 a.m. Central Time. The opening of the window is about 17.5 minutes from now. The robotic systems flight controller by the call sign of Robo here in Mission Control will send commands to open up the snares on the end effector of the Canadarm2 robotic arm to allow Dragon to be set free Dragon then will conduct 3 so-called departure burns, 3 firings of its main engine to move to a safe distance away from the station and to exit what is called the approach ellipsoid, which is the mythical cone around the station that is called the neighborhood of the International Space Station. At that point, NASA is complete with its part of the joint mission with SpaceX for this delivery run of the Dragon cargo craft. At that point, everything is in control by the SpaceX flight controllers in Hawthorne, California. Early this afternoon at about 1:06 p.m. Central Time, the SpaceX flight control team will send commands for SpaceX's engine to fire for 13 minutes and 25 seconds a long deorbit burn, which will be a braking maneuver, a retrograde firing of the SpaceX's engine to allow it to slow down and drop out of orbit for its descent back into the Earth's atmosphere. The lower portion of the spacecraft, where the solar arrays are positioned, is called the trunk of Dragon. It will separate at about 1:24 p.m. Central Time, and about 29 minutes later, the main chutes on Dragon will be deployed, and from there, about 7 or 8 minutes later, we expect splashdown in the Pacific, about 403 miles to the southwest of the port of Long Beach, California. SpaceX recovery ship is on scene with its recovery personnel to pick up the Dragon spacecraft, get it on that recovery ship, and begin steaming toward Long Beach, California, with an arrival for the destowing of the critical cargo in the early morning hours of Monday, May 7th. So there's your timeline for Dragon activities following departure later today. SpaceX is returning to Earth almost 4,000 pounds of cargo, as we mentioned earlier. The return cargo on this particular Dragon craft is broken down, as you can see in this graphic, between crew supplies, critical science investigations, spacewalk equipment that will be refurbished and reflown at a later time, vehicle hardware, computer resources, and in the trunk of Dragon, unpressurized payloads, most of which is in the form of a discarded pump flow control subassembly. That is a 235-pound component, one of several on the International Space Station, that regulate the flow of ammonia coolant through the cooling loops of the space station. It is considered a failed component and will be discarded in the trunk of Dragon as part of the swapping out of pump flow control subassemblies that will continue through the next spacewalk that is scheduled on the International Space Station on May 16th by Expedition 55 flight engineers Drew Feustel and Ricky Arnold of NASA, who will continue the swap out of pump flow control subassembly components. They will also change out a camera assembly on the truss of the International Space Station. But the focus of attention today is on the release of Dragon that is coming up just a few minutes from now. We will be moving into an orbital sunset also over the Indian Ocean a few minutes from now. All is in readiness for the release of Dragon as we move towards the commands that will open up the snares on the end effector of the Canadarm2 robotic arm, allowing Dragon to be set free. Everything is in readiness from a space station systems perspective for the release of Dragon. We are in a short handover between satellites on the tracking and data relay satellite system. We'll regain communications and our downlink television signal with Dragon and the International Space Station just a short time from now. In Hawthorne, California, the Dragon flight control team at the SpaceX Mission Control Center pulled all of their positions. They're all go for the release of Dragon and take over all of the rest of Dragon's operations through this afternoon's splashdown. Rick Henfling, the flight director here in the International Space Station Flight Control Team, also conducted a final poll of his team here, and everybody is in readiness for the release of Dragon, with the window expected to open just about 12 minutes from now. Aboard the International Space Station, the Expedition 55 crew under the command of Russian cosmonaut Anton Shkaplerov normally would have a relaxing off-duty day on this Saturday, but this is a high period of quite a bit of activity, both research-wise and operationally, on board the International Outpost, and so today is a full workday for the crew. They've been working pretty hard getting Dragon ready for its departure.
Dragon configuration checks. Perform step 2 in 1.602 Dragon departure monitoring.
Copy that, Houston. Step 2 is in work.
Leslie Ringo informing flight engineer Scott Tingle of NASA, who is in the cupola of the International Space Station at the robotic workstation to prepare for monitoring of the departure of Dragon. The actual release of the cargo craft is in the hands of the robotic ground controllers here in Houston, who will send those commands. Tingle in the cupola is serving as a backup to the robotic ground control team, and will also be monitoring Dragon's systems as it executes its 3 departure burns to move to a safe distance away from the International Space Station.
Dave Harm, I'm working on that. Stand by. And Houston, station on 2 for Dragon. We see a good strobe light on the Dragon, and the CCP LED status is nominal.
Copy out.
Here in the flight control room, the visiting vehicle officer, Dave Harshman, is talking to his backroom operators, getting a final go for the release of Dragon. He is relaying that information to Flight Director Rick Henfling. Everything is in readiness. The opening of the release window just under 10 minutes from now. We'll be reacquiring our communications with the International Space Station and our downlink television signal momentarily. Flight Director Rick Henfling taking a final poll around the room here for approval for the release of Dragon. With the impending departure of SpaceX from the International Space Station, the next resupply mission to the station is scheduled just 2 weeks from tomorrow, on Sunday, May 20th, when Orbital ATK is scheduled to launch its Cygnus spacecraft on an Antares rocket from the Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. We'll be on the air that morning at 3:30 a.m. Central Time, 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, May 20th. Launch time is scheduled at 4:04 a.m. Central, 5:04 a.m. Eastern Time. Another weekend activity for the continuing resupply of the International Space Station. Just 6.5 minutes now until the opening of the release window for Dragon. We'll be hearing internally here calls from the robotics officer here in Mission Control on the steps he is taking to send commands to open up the snares that will free Dragon from the grasp of the Canadarm2 robotic arm and send it on its way. Back now with our live downlink from the International Space Station, a variety of views of the Dragon cargo craft. Still attached to the Canadarm2 robotic arm, as it will be for the next few minutes before it is released. The International Space Station is currently flying 256 statute miles over the southern Indian Ocean, moving from southwest to northeast in an orbit inclined 51.6 degrees to either side of the equator. This path will take the station just to the west of Adelaide, Australia, a few minutes from now. And this view shows the same view that Scott Tingle is looking at inside the cupola of the International Space Station. You can see the strobe light on the Dragon cargo craft as it will illuminate its path as it departs the vicinity of the International Space Station. Again, Tingle is serving as a backup to the robotic ground control team here. And will be monitoring Dragon systems as it departs 2 gate posts. First one called the Keep Out Sphere, which is the immediate neighborhood of the International Space Station. The second is called the Approach Ellipsoid, which is the demarcation point at which NASA basically hands over flight control responsibilities to their Dragon flight control team counterparts in Hawthorne, California for the remainder of Dragon's mission.
And Station Houston on 2, go for Dragon departure on time. Perform step 3 and 4 in 1.602 Dragon departure monitoring.
Copy that. Step 3 and 4 in work. Thank you.
And Flight Director Rick Henfling here in Mission Control instructing the robotics officer, who is the lead for this SpaceX mission, Cash Donahoe, to begin configuring his systems for the commanding of the opening of the snares on the Canadarm2 robotic arm. Less than 2 minutes now until the opening of the release window. The window itself is about 18 minutes in length, which is driven by not only lighting conditions to monitor the departure of the Dragon from the station, but also the ballistic trajectory of the spacecraft once it departs the station. That will be monitored and updated for guidance, navigation, and control by the SpaceX flight controllers in Hawthorne, California. The optimum release time itself, the physical release of Dragon from the arm, is scheduled at 8:24 a.m. Central Time, but that's not a fixed number. It is a variable time.
Station Houston on 2, ISS thrusters inhibited, and ground M1 is go for release on time. The next calls will be from Robo.
2 copies.
Robo is the call sign for the robotics officer here in Mission Control, Cash Donahoe. It's his show now. Everything is in readiness for the release of this cargo craft. And we are now in the release window itself. We are expecting an on-time release at about 8:24 Central Time.
Station Houston on 2, proceeding with release.
2 copies, thank you.
Station Houston, release commanded.
2 copies.
That is Cash Donahoe, the robotics officer here in Mission Control, initiating the opening of the snares.
Station Houston, snares open, begin monitoring for drift out.
M2, and work.
Release confirmed at 8:23 a.m. Central Time, 8:23 a.m. Central Time, 9:23 a.m. Eastern Time, as the International Space Station and Dragon flew 256 miles just south of Australia.
M1, M2, pin has exited the lee, go for back away.
Houston copies, proceeding to back away.
That back away call from Scott Tingle in the cupola at the robotic workstation of the International Space Station. He will now maneuver the Canadarm2 robotic arm to back away from the vicinity of Dragon as it slowly moves away. The first in the trio of departure burns by Dragon's engine, expected about a minute and a half from now.
Station Houston, back off in progress.
Two copies, thank you.
There's the view of the Canadarm2 robotic arm backing away from Dragon, standing by for the first of the 3 departure burns by the spacecraft.
Houston copies.
You can see the grapple fixture clearly in the field of view on the Dragon cargo craft. The door that is open is called the GNC door, the Guidance, Navigation, and Control door. That will be closed just before the deorbit burn is enacted later this afternoon.
M1, M2, 4.5 meters, departure commanded.
Houston copies, departure commanded.
The first of the 3 departure burns in progress. First burn is complete. It was a 7-second burn. The second of the 2 burns is planned just a few moments from now. That will be a 12-second burn to induce an opening rate of 0.21 meters per second.
1 minute. Monitor per step 5 in 1.602.
And 2 copies, we'll go.
And Station Houston on 2, back away complete.
M2.
Flight controllers reporting good stability with the Dragon craft as it continues to move away from the International Space Station. Its release coming at 8:23 a.m. Central Time. The second of the 2 burns underway. It was a good burn, according to the visiting vehicle officer. The third in the series of burns to complete Dragon's departure from the station is planned about 7 minutes from now. That will be a much longer burn of 22 seconds in duration, completing the opening rate required for Dragon to depart the approach ellipsoid, or the neighborhood of the International Space Station.
Station Houston on 2, ISS thrusters enabled.
And 2.
Again, Dragon safely on its way. One more burn to depart the vicinity of the International Space Station. Dragon will be a safe distance away from the complex for its deorbit burn coming up at 1:06 p.m. Central Time today. That will be a 13-minute, 25-second retrograde maneuver, a braking maneuver by Dragon's engine to slow it down by 113.8 meters per second, allowing it to drop out of orbit for its descent back to Earth and a parachute-assisted splashdown in the Pacific, some 403 statute miles southwest of Long Beach, California. As mentioned earlier, Dragon is returning almost 4,000 pounds of cargo back to Earth, critical science experiments and spare parts and other equipment to be refurbished and returned to the station at a later date. Once Dragon splashes down in the Pacific this afternoon, where the weather is fairly benign, according to SpaceX recovery officials. It, again, is scheduled to splash down some 400 miles southwest of Long Beach, California. It will be recovered by the SpaceX recovery team out there at the splashdown zone, and then they will head back to Long Beach, about a 43-hour trip back to the recovery site on deck, where Dragon will be dispositioned, ultimately its cargo to be removed and the vehicle itself to be transported to McGregor, Texas, to be refurbished for reflight at a later date. We're coming up on the third of the departure burns by Dragon. We're about 30 seconds away from the third in the series of departure burns for Dragon. And the third in the series of departure burns underway. And the third departure burn is now complete. All three burns conducted on time, and according to the visiting vehicle officer here in Mission Control, we're all right on the money.
And Station Houston on 2, departure burn 3 is complete. Dragon is outside the keep out sphere.
Copy that, Leslie. We confirm. All looks nominal here. Nice job to Cash.
And he appreciates those words.
Copy. And I see us complete in 1.602.
And we concur with you, Scott.
Thank you, Leslie.
Just a couple of minutes away from Dragon departing the so-called approach ellipsoid, which is the mythical cone around the station called the neighborhood, if you will, of the space station, at which point integrated operations between the flight control team here in Houston and the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne will be completed. Just to recap activities, Dragon was released from the Canadarm2 robotic arm at 8:23 a.m. Central Time, conducted a series of departure burns, 3 of them, to move away from the station. The robotics officer here in Mission Control worked with Scott Tingle, the NASA flight engineer for Expedition 55, in the cupola of the International Space Station, to back the arm away from Dragon as it began its motion away from the orbital outpost. Dragon is now exiting the approach ellipsoid out of the vicinity of the International Space Station. It will move to a safe distance away from the station for its... We now have confirmation that Dragon is outside of the approach ellipsoid, so everything continues to proceed per the timeline. Dragon will be commanded.
Station Houston on 2. Dragon is outside the approach ellipsoid on a safe 24-hour free drift trajectory.
Copy that, Leslie. Thank you.
Dragon will be commanded by the SpaceX flight controllers in Hawthorne, California, to execute a 13-minute, 25-second deorbit burn at 1:06 p.m. Central Time today. That will slow Dragon down by just over 113 meters per second, allowing it to drop out of orbit for its descent back through the Earth's atmosphere and a splashdown in the Pacific at about 2 p.m. Central Time, just around noon Pacific Time, some 400 miles southwest of Long Beach, California. This is Mission Control Houston, the International Space Station, and its 6-member crew flying over the Pacific Ocean, moving from southwest to northeast in an orbit inclined 51.6 degrees to either side of the equator. The Dragon cargo craft was set free about 35 minutes ago at about 8:23 a.m. Central Time, as the robotics officer here in Mission Control sent commands to open up the snares on the end effector of the Canadarm2 robotic arm that had held Dragon in place since it was unberthed from the Earth-facing port of the Harmony module yesterday and moved into its release position for its departure this morning. Again, the release time was 8:23 a.m. Central Time. Dragon executed 3 departure burns to move to a safe distance away from the station, where it will continue to move for the next several hours before its deorbit burn at 1:06 p.m. Central Time, 2:06 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon. Splashdown is scheduled in the Pacific at 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific Time, about 400 miles to the southwest of Long Beach, California. The SpaceX recovery team is on scene in the splashdown zone, ready to begin safing the Dragon spacecraft and beginning the 43-hour trip back to port for the unstowing of all of the critical science and hardware that is being returned on the resupply vehicle. So with Dragon safely on its way, we would remind you that all of the subsequent activities for the Dragon cargo craft today will be updated on the SpaceX website with all of the forthcoming functions of the Dragon mission in control of the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California. We can wrap up with a couple of programming notes, however. A double header today for NASA with the launch of the InSight spacecraft to Mars out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. That spacecraft safely on its way to the Red Planet for an arrival in November, and the departure of Dragon from the International Space Station to wrap up a 4-week resupply run for the crew members on board the International Outpost. Next for us here in the world of the International Space Station will be a briefing on Tuesday, May 8th at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, to preview the next pair of spacewalks on tap for Drew Feustel and Ricky Arnold outside of the International Space Station. The next spacewalk to be conducted on May 16th by Feustel and Arnold to swap out pump flow control subassembly components. These are basically big cooling systems that control the flow of coolant ammonia through the loops of the International Space Station. The spacewalk by Feustel and Arnold next, coming up on Wednesday, May 16th, with our coverage beginning on NASA TV at 5:30 a.m. Central Time. 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, the spacewalk scheduled to begin at 7:10 a.m. Central, 8:10 a.m. Eastern Time. And it won't be long before the next supply run of the station gets underway. That will be by Orbital ATK with the launch of their Cygnus spacecraft on an Antares rocket from the Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. Our coverage on NASA TV originating from the Johnson Space Center and Wallops will begin on Sunday, May 20th, 2 weeks from tomorrow, at 3:30 a.m. Central Time, 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time, with a 5-minute launch window scheduled at 4:04 a.m. Central, 5:04 a.m. Eastern Time. So you'll want to tune in for all of those activities for International Space Station operations and the crew of Expedition 55. For now, we'll wrap up our coverage here at the Johnson Space Center. Thank you for joining us today. SpaceX Dragon cargo craft safely on its way, headed for a splashdown in the Pacific this afternoon. Have a great weekend. This is Mission Control Houston.